Here to consider the future of work, please welcome Starbucks' Blair Taylor. Blair is Chief Community Officer. David Rolfe, International Vice President of SEIU 775. Uber's Director of Federal and Community Affairs, Lindsay Elin. The Roosevelt Institute's Dorian Warren. And Maureen Conway, who heads the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute.
Well, good morning, everyone. We are delighted. I have a fabulous set of folks here to talk with me about the future of work. And just to take a couple minutes to set the stage, I run the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute. And at the Economic Opportunities Program, we're looking at a variety of strategies and policies that people are working with to help low and moderate income Americans get to better livelihoods in today's economy. And whether that's through helping them get skills and get to better jobs, or whether that's helping them start their own business and create their own work. There's a variety of things that we're working with organizations all across the country to help people get to better livelihoods. But one of the things that we see, of course, today is that people are really struggling with, how do I make a living in today's economy that I can support myself and my family on? How do I, through my work, get to that American dream and be able to support myself? And we're talking about inequality, of course, today. And inequality at work, people think, work is where you earn your income, right? So income inequality, obviously, is pretty central to inequality. But there's other dimensions of work that I think it's also important to keep in mind as we think about work, the changing nature of work, the future of work, and inequality, right? So work is not only where you get your income, but for many people, it's a source of things like health insurance, opportunities to save for retirement. It gives you disability insurance and other important insurance that gives you a more stable economic foundation. Some people, probably many people in this room, have salaried employment. You get paid the same amount every week, every month. But many people work hourly. Over half of America's workers are still hourly paid, and their incomes can fluctuate very much. And we've seen that income instability, income volatility can also be economically destabilizing. So these questions around how do we organize work have many dimensions to them, and they have multiple layers. And so into the mix of this changing nature of work, of course, we have platform work and other new forms of work that are starting to blur the lines between employment, self-employment, and how we think about work. So there's a lot of questions about work and people's ability to live on it today, as well as sort of how is it changing going into the future. So we're thinking about these questions and, are these new opportunities for Americans to finally get a break and get ahead, or are there additional hurdles that they're going to be struggling with as they try to move forward? So a big topic and not a lot of time. So let me just launch right in with you, Dorian, because I think that you at the Roosevelt Institute, you've been doing a lot of work on this changing nature of work, questions of work, and what are some of the drivers that have sort of brought us to kind of where we are today, both in terms of things like technological change and other kinds of economic factors, but also some of the policies and things that people have been talking about. What are the choices we've been making about the rules that govern work that have affected where we are now?
That's a very small question, Maureen. Thank
I
you.
know. 2 minutes, right?
2 minutes. So I'll just point out three things that have changed the nature and meaning of work for all of us, frankly, in the last 40 or so years. The first is the changing employment relationship. It used to be you'd go to work, you'd find a job at a big manufacturing company, for instance, think General Motors or Ford. You work for that employer for an entire career. You got your benefits from your employer. You got health care and vacation and retirement security. And that relationship, as we all know, has changed dramatically. So that now there is a big question about, for instance, who is your real boss? If I get hired to clean up a Walmart store, do I work for the subcontractor or do I work for Walmart? Who has the power in that relationship? So that's one big change, and I think Heather Boucher mentioned this a little bit earlier, that this question of subcontracting and who is your real boss in terms of the supply chain in a labor market. Secondly, with these changes in the nature of work, we haven't rewritten the rules to supply people with economic security. So Jacob Hacker, a political scientist, calls this policy drift. So for instance, in terms of the minimum wage, as we all know, the real value of the minimum wage has declined since 1968. We have a hard time updating the minimum wage. So the intent of that policy to provide some kind of basic level of dignity for Americans who go to work, we've let that decline, and our attempts to update the policy have failed to update that policy, including a range of other labor market standards. We have a 20th century model of labor market standards and employment regulations, and we're in a 21st century economy. So we've failed to update a range of employment policies that can address the changing nature of work. And then the last thing I'll say is, because you notice I hadn't mentioned robots yet. So the robots are coming, but we've been saying that for 50 years, but this time might be
Maybe longer than that.
it might be different. So technology, for sure, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this, technology is changing the nature and meaning of work. So that we're going back. People say, oh, we're in a gig economy, it's new. Actually, no, the gig economy is old. That was the economy before the 20th century. People had piecework, and they worked on gigs. And then we created something called careers and a job and employment in the 20th century. And so we tend to conflate this historical moment with how it's always been. So we're actually back to where we were in the 18th and 19th centuries in terms of the nature of the economy. We have to figure out some policies that can support workers, provide security as well as flexibility in this new and future economy.
Great, thank you, Doran. Well, Lindsay, that leads right, I think, to you and the work that Uber is doing. Uber is sort of, I think everybody's, the first company that comes to mind, everybody thinks about new forms of work, the platform economy, and what's happening with that. And I know you've been thinking a lot about, so why do people choose this kind of work in today's economy? And who are the folks that really you are seeing gravitate more towards this kind of work?
Well, first I want to thank the Aspen Institute for inviting Uber to be part of this conversation. What we're discovering is that people are turning to the Uber platform to supplement their incomes, to make a little extra cash. Wage stagnation is a real problem, and people are looking for opportunities to help pay the bills or earn a little extra spending money. I recently had an Uber driver who was picking me up after she, as she said, she bought one too many pairs of shoes at Marshall's, right? And I was thinking, that's pretty cool that at a touch of a button, basically at a touch of a button, she had the opportunity to make a little extra cash, right? The catch is, and the important thing to note is that it's the flexibility of the platform that attracts people to drive on the Uber platform. Nearly 90% of Uber drivers here in the US have said that the major reason that they drive on the Uber platform is because they have the opportunity to be their own boss, to create their own schedule. So that opportunity for flexible income is what really attracts people to drive with us. What's interesting is that I started at Uber about 10 months ago, and when I got started, we had about 165,000 driver partners here in the U.S. Today, we're over 400,000 driver partners, and those are people who are taking at least 4 trips a month. There are many, many more who are taking 1 or 2 trips a month. But that adds up. This year, Uber partners have earned over $3.5 billion, and that's something. So I think it's really it's that ability for flexible income that people are looking for.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. And David, I'm going to come to you next, and you out in Seattle now, and across the Northwest, work with home care workers in particular. And I think, we think about sort of the changing nature of work and technology and platform work, but you work with the largest occupation and projected to grow tremendously, home care workers, as we sort of need health and health care. And certainly, a lot of technology is changing how health care is delivered. But I think in many ways, home caregiving retains its essential caregiving, human-to-human character. And yet, these are really difficult jobs that largely women are doing. And so I'm a little conscious of the irony of the woman asking the man what's going on in the world of caregiving. But what is your perspective on, how we should be thinking about these occupations that really aren't going away, and that this will be part of our future of work, and what are the issues we should be lifting up as we think about this work?
Yeah. So in some ways, home care was maybe the leading indicator or the canary in the coal mine about the future of work. Because while many of us spent decades working to try to make home care jobs into quote unquote real jobs with predictable wages and covered by benefits and paying taxes and the kind of predictability and certainty that's necessary to create a middle class, the rest of work was in some ways becoming more like home care. I think it's important to note, it was not a technology-enabled phenomenon that excluded home care workers from the Fair Labor Standards Act in the 1930s. And when we talk about the fissured workplace that David Weil has written about, or when we talk about the fact that America is now a low-wage nation, with 50% of Americans earning less than $17 an hour, and 30% earning less than $10 an hour, those were facts of life in the home care world from the very beginning. And in fact, for most caregiving, as well as agricultural, and a huge number of other professions that were largely associated with female employment or employment of people of color. So I think that the way to think about home care, but I would argue now home care is the new normal, right? With part-time, unbenefited, low-wage work proliferating in every sector. What we ultimately have to think about is, all right, what are the set of policy interventions and what are the power-building concepts to replace as Dorian points out, sort of the now rusty legacy model employment policies of the mid-20th century with something that is actually future-facing, but that can achieve the same ultimate goals of economic power, scale, and sustainability for low-wage workers, not to something that was addressed a couple panels ago, not just because it's the fair thing to do, but because we live in an economy where 70% of our demand is driven by consumer spending, and ultimately inequality is bad even for the rich.
Yeah, great, thank you, David. Blair, I want to come to you, and I think Starbucks, in terms of thinking about some of the how to build stability into hourly employment, has done some interesting things, right? Starbucks pioneered offering part-time workers health insurance and has an equity sharing program and these kinds of things. But I wanted to ask you about the work you're doing now, thinking about, so David talked about the issues for people of color and women workers, but you're really thinking about youth and younger workers trying to get into the labor market, people whose labor force participation is down and who are really struggling to get into work at all. And you have the 100,000 Opportunities Initiative that you've been engaging a lot of other companies in working with you on. Why is it that you're focusing on these youth? Why is this important from sort of Starbucks or from a general business perspective?
Well, first, I too would like to thank Aspen for just inviting us and then hosting this convening incredible exchange of ideas. So thank you for that. This issue of disengaged youth, I believe, is perhaps the greatest issue of our time. In the U.S., the number is around 5.5 million young people who are 16 to 24, not at work, not in school. Worldwide, the estimates are north of 300 million young people across the globe. You simply cannot take that many young people out of our economy and think about a future that looks anything like the past in terms of the U.S. economy. And I think the interesting moment that we're in right now is there's recognition of that. There's recognition not just from the social sector and from the government sector and the philanthropic sector, if you will, but there's recognition of that from the corporate sector. And quite frankly, I think that's a good thing. I'm 100% behind philanthropy. I came from the world of nonprofit, running large nonprofits for many years. I'm the president of our foundation, and I believe in the world of philanthropy with all my heart. That said, in order to combat a problem that is that enormous, that's that gigantic, it's going to take a cross-sector collaboration. And I think the beauty of the moment that we're in right now is there's a recognition on the side of American business that their future is in fact tied up to the destiny of those young people. So those aren't just young people who are disengaged from society. Those are our future labor pool. We need them as part of our labor pool. Companies are recognizing that increasingly. And maybe more importantly, to the point that was just made, or as importantly, those are our future consumers. And without them buying our products and having the jobs and the income to be able to do that, we are going to be in serious trouble. So companies like ours are very focused against that. We have built a coalition now of 35 companies in total that are focusing in together on hiring 100,000 of this disengaged or opportunity youth population, as they're now called. And we're doing that because it is the right thing to do, and corporations can do the right thing, and that's very important. But we're also doing it because it's in our best interest to do it. And the good news about that is if we want something to be sustainable in the long term, we have to think about it outside of corporate philanthropy. We have to think about how do we get that into the engine of corporate America. The engine of corporate America is all about hiring and all about people. And if we can get that incredible population, which we've heard this today, earlier this morning, about we have an incredibly latent talent in this country. We have young people who have incredible skills, who have ambition, who have passion, who have all of the things that we need in the 21st century to be successful. They may need some soft skills training. They may need some support. They may have systemic barriers to employment. We've built a coalition of for-profit and nonprofit, working very closely with the Aspen Institute, focusing in on cities as a unit of change, and with the intention of hiring 100,000 young people and looking at the issue holistically. So we have nonprofits and for-profits working together to solve a problem. And I think that nonprofits focusing in on what they do best, which is getting young people ready for work, for-profits focusing in on what we do best, which is hiring young people and getting them into the workforce. And I'll say this last thing, and that is, I believe that in the end, as much as I value all of the workforce preparation, education, I'm a huge proponent of education and have been for my entire career. But a job and a career is the end game. We have to think about that very carefully. If we're doing all this preparation work and young people are coming out and not getting a job, you could make the argument that college is a waste of money if you come out of it and you can't get employment. And so we really have to think about that transition, that inflection point. And that's what we're trying to do with this coalition, is move young people from workforce ready into a job and into a career, and hopefully, once they're in a company, give them a pathway to opportunity, whether it's inside that company or a pathway to being an entrepreneur in the future.
Great, thank you. So that was a perfect segue, because I did have a plan with this panel, which was to sort of lay down some issues and then transition to ideas for change, right? And what are some ideas and solutions, so we don't be too dead depressing up here. So so that's a perfect transition. And Lindsay, actually, I wanted to come to you next, and I wanted to sort of pick up a little bit on some things you were describing about why people come to Uber, and also build out on that a little bit, because you talked about how people are looking for some flexibility and they're looking to sort of supplement their income. And I know, we did an event a year ago, I think, on sort of sharing economy, and talked to some of your colleagues. And I think, definitely even then people were saying this is what people really value. But there was also a recognition that, some of these other things about work, that lead to stability, like health insurance and things like that, that if you're working independently are hard to come by. And I'm just curious sort of what your thinking is as a company at Uber about how do you help people access some of these things that may be building stability into their work?
Yep. It's a great question. We are spending a lot of time thinking about this and talking about this. It really is important, though, to point out, and even over the past year, really understanding who our drivers are and why they're driving on the Uber platform. Over 50% of Uber drivers are driving less than 10 hours a week. 40% less than 8 hours a week. And we continue to see that decrease and decline. And in fact, we launched this very cool product earlier this week called Destination. We launched it out in San Francisco. The idea with this is that if you are commuting to work every day and you've got a 30-minute commute each way, you put in your final destination and you can pick up a ride into your final destination. You know what? Make a little extra cash, and maybe that turns out to be your gas money for the week or your parking expenses in the city, right? So again, this idea of this product really fitting into people's already very busy lives. With that being said, this is really important. And that's why we are having conversations with everyone, and why we are eager to sit down and continue conversations with policymakers and experts, and continue to talk to our drivers, and really understand what they are looking for and what their needs are. David and some others about a week ago released a very interesting set of principles. We've been having conversations with folks, and we'll continue to have conversations. So where we are right now is really just trying to understand it further, and what it would look like and what it would mean for Uber. So we will continue this conversation, and I'm sure we'll come back and continue it.
Great. Well, terrific. So I've been involved in that conversation with David and with others, and I know Dorian's also been involved in this conversation. And Dorian, I was thinking about this. I was going to ask you about this to think about what are policies, and thinking, Dorian sort of exemplifies this. He works for the Roosevelt Institute. He's got MSNBC. He does consulting on the side. He's working like multiple jobs. So here you are, Mr. Future of Work.
My Obamacare, thank you.
And I know you've been working with a variety of folks, with Center for Community Change and others, on how do we build stability and what are some policy ideas, and maybe you can just talk a little bit about that.
So can I punt that question around, because David actually was one of the leaders in that, and pivot to the other part of the equation of the policy ideas, and that's political will, because we have lots of ideas out there, lots of really great ideas. Portable benefits, which I think David can talk about. You signed that letter too, Maureen. But what does it matter if there's no political will to actually change the rules of the game, the rules of the economy, and to implement and enforce the rules? And I think that's the other part of the equation we have to be serious and honest about. And thankfully, we are, I think, in a movement moment. When you look out across the political landscape, we're having a whole discussion about $15 an hour minimum wage, actually led by David first in Seattle, that we weren't having 3 years ago. Today, we're having a whole conversation about inequality, and the question is not, is inequality rising or not, or is it good or bad? The question is, what are we going to do about it? And so I think we have to have the political will, and what does it take to create the political will, whether it's at the national level, the state level, the local level, in terms of climate change, even the global level. And I do strongly believe, and I look at history, social movements are a key ingredient of creating the political will, putting issues on the agenda when political elites don't want to address certain issues, of making sure that whether it starts in cities, we have experimentation with new kinds of policies and rules that actually empower people and provide a basis for stability and security. So political will, I think, has to be part of the conversation in addition to the new ideas.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so David, I guess I come to you next here. But I do want you to say one thing about this, and then I also do want you to say, because you've done so much work with workers, and I think one of the things that often is really missing sometimes is how do we engage workers themselves. Lindsay was talking about what do we hear from our drivers. If you could talk about what are ways in more different conversations we could be hearing the experience of workers, and how do we make sure that happens too. So you have a 2 question.
Okay. So I think there are really 3 big buckets of work we have to figure out how to accomplish. One is rewriting the employment contract for the 21st century. A second is rewriting the social contract for the 21st century. And I think and the third is rewriting the rules of power and how power works in our society and our economy. And I think what we will find on the first 2 buckets is that the 20th century American model, where we assigned all of the cost and risk of ranging from health benefits to collective bargaining to pensions to specific employers, worked really well in an era of relative immobility of both labor and capital and lifelong employment within a single industry or craft. But that we now need to rethink that model from a design perspective into how you actually maybe assign employers just a high minimum wage responsibility, safe workplaces, humane scheduling, and employment non-discrimination, and actually take everything else and have it be owned by the worker themselves, even if the employer is ultimately the payer. Which then gets to the new social contract question, and how do we think about portable, universal, prorated benefits of all sorts, ranging from benefits many of us are accustomed to, like healthcare and retirement, to the kinds of benefits that we never thought of as benefits, but things like lifelong learning accounts and the ability to get new credentials and new competencies throughout a career, and have those be owned by workers and portable. And then the question of power really is the hardest question, because this gets straight to the heart of the political will question that Dorian raises. Power comes from one of three things. It comes from the control of money, the control of armed forces, or from collective action. And the collective action element is the only one available for American workers. But the lost power of the industrial strike, I mean, if you want change, you have to have power. Power is the currency of change. It tends to come initially from disruption or the credible threat of disruption. And so the question of how workers can disrupt a low-wage economy, it becomes the most important question facing us in the 21st century. To your second question, in Seattle, the truth is we have a great mayor, we have a great city council, we have great labor leaders, we have great community partners, but $15 happened because low-wage workers had the courage to walk off the job and go on strike. It happened because airport workers had the courage to file their own ballot measure in CTAC and say, if we can't get a union contract the old-fashioned way, fine, we'll just write one into law. And that forced a civic conversation in Seattle where instead of someone like me bargaining a single employer contract between one union and one employer, we sat across the table with the head of the Chamber of Commerce, the owner of the Space Needle, the head of the Hotel Association, and the head of the Restaurant Association, and bargained a $15 wage for the whole city. And that ultimately was based on the fact that low-wage workers themselves were willing to walk off the job, tell their stories, and convince our city, 74% of the voters supported that the value of a French fry cook was not the value of the French fries, it was the value of a citizen, the value of a neighbor, the value of a family member, and the value of a customer.
So, Blair, you talked earlier about collaboration, and there are so many dimensions of collaboration that people have sort of brought up, and so many different actors. But I was wondering if you could, so there's labor actors, there's nonprofit actors, there's education actors, there's corporate actors, there's a wide variety of folks who are sort of engaged in some of these questions of work. How do we connect people to work? How do we help people succeed in work? And how do we rethink the structure of work? And I'm wondering, these are hard things to collaborate around. And you have talked a little bit about both intra and inter-sector collaboration, and maybe you can just say a little bit about what can make that work. How can that go forward?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We have actually set up systems that are antithetical to collaboration. And here's what I mean by that. If you look at the nonprofit sector, for example, the nonprofit sector is really independent. And in fact is in many instances is funded to be independent, and everything is seen as a zero-sum game. So in other words, if I don't want to help the nonprofit down the street, because if I do, that may mean that some of my resources get taken away and siphoned off, and before you know it, I'm out of business and you're in business, right? So we've actually set up a system in many ways that unfortunately is not designed to be collaborative. And I think, interestingly enough, on the corporate side, we don't collaborate very well either on social issues. We will collaborate by basically acquiring another company. That's our form of collaboration in the corporate sector. But in terms of really working together to solve social issues, we don't have a great track record of that. So the intra-sector collaboration is not very good. The inter-sector collaboration is even a bigger gap because you actually have two different languages that you're speaking from the nonprofit sector to the for-profit sector. And I often say to nonprofit leaders when I'm talking to them, if you're sitting in a room and you're talking about jobs and job training and you don't have a corporation in the room with you, stop and think about what you're doing. I mean, if you don't have somebody in the room who actually has the jobs to hire the young people, how are you designing and creating a system that's going to be effective, right? So I think the underlying premise of just thinking about having each other in the room, we often start from a false start with respect to that. Here's where I think we are today and why I think this moment is different and exciting. I think we are at the point now where both sides, the nonprofit philanthropic sector, the for-profit side, and I'd even throw in government, and when I say government, no offense to the people in DC, but I'm usually talking about local government, not federal government. And I mean that because I think mayors and local municipalities are actually getting things done every single day on behalf of their constituents. Whereas we know that while the federal government has a big role in our society, there's been a tremendous amount of gridlock at that level with respect to making significant social change. So federal government to me has a great role in scaling things. It's probably not going to be the innovator of the 21st century. So when we stop and think about the moment we're in today, we actually have a moment in time where corporations are extremely interested in trying to figure out how to sit down with nonprofits and municipalities and work things through. Hence, that is the whole backdrop for the 35 Company Coalition. Nonprofits and philanthropic sector, I think, are at the point where they are actually saying, you know what, we've tried a number of different things. Is there a chance and an opportunity for us to figure out how to approach this differently in the 21st century? And what's interesting about that is we now have an intra-sector collaboration opportunity and an inter-sector collaboration opportunity that I think we've been driven to partly by the fact that we've tried so many other things and they haven't necessarily addressed some of the major issues in our society. Now, there's one caveat to all of that, and the caveat is this is very time sensitive. I believe we have a window of time to actually put together some of these collaborations, and it's painful how quickly we probably have to move. And the reason I say that is because any one incident across the globe could pull the corporate sector back out of this, for example. So if we had a meltdown of the China economy, or we had a global economic issue, all of a sudden corporations would say, you know, that great experiment we were trying, it hasn't quite borne the fruit that we need and the data that we need to substantiate it yet, so we're going to pull back. And so I think we have an incredible opportunity, but we have a limited window. And that's why there's such a sense of urgency from me and from other companies, from our CEO, Howard Schultz, and others who are saying, let's try to get through this window while we can. Let's try to figure out how to lock arms with those two different systems, if you will, and start to create a common language and a common set of principles and approaches that I think will behoove us in the 21st century.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're in the lightning round. So Blair brings up this issue that, the federal role is maybe not to direct things, but to scale things, right? And we're in the full presidential season at this point with it. So what are the issues, just each of you think that, what's one issue you think the presidential candidates, whichever, should be bringing up more if they're going to think about what's the federal role in improving conditions of work and creating opportunity? And I'm just going to go down the line. Dorian.
At a minimum, a $200 billion a year investment in the highest poverty communities, particularly communities of color in this country. Communities that have been disinvested in for decades, and we've walked and looked away as if it doesn't affect us when it actually does. So a $200 billion commitment a year from the federal government for reinvestment in those communities, ensuring that those in most need of job access, job training, and investments in infrastructure get the resources they need and have been lacking for decades.
That was very good, very specific. In the face of wage stagnation and this desire to find work-life balance, it is just incredibly important that people understand what the on-demand economy brings, and that opportunity for flexible income is of value. So better understanding that piece.
I think we need a new commitment to recreate and reinvest in the middle class in the 21st century. We are still the richest nation on earth. We are the most productive nation on earth. We've created more wealth here in the last 40 years than was created in all of human history, but we distributed 95% of that wealth to the top 1%, 5% to the next 10%, 0% to the next 90%. We asked the bottom 50% to take a pay cut. The net economic impact of women doubling their workforce participation since 1977 has been $0 in take-home pay for the bottom 90% of income-earning families, and it now takes 3 incomes to live the same life that a middle-class family earned in 1977. No one would have voted for that vision. If Jerry Ford or Jimmy Carter had campaigned on it, they would have lost the election. And if a Soviet politician had said that was their vision for America, we would have sent the USS Iowa into the Baltic Sea as a way of sending a signal that we were not going to tolerate any more of that talk. Instead, we followed leaders of both parties who, through malice and negligence, created record level of inequality greater than in the days of slavery, greater than on the eve of the 1929 economic crash. Low wages are a choice, and we should make a different one. And that's what is up to the next president of the United States to decide. No one is going to remember any of us up here in 100 years. We'll remember the name of the president. We won't remember today's famous entertainers, today's famous CEOs. But Americans in 100 years will remember when the American dream was at its greatest level of risk, whether a handful of courageous people stood up and did something about it.
Totally agree.
Totally agree.
Sorry, I cut into your time,
Okay.
Blair.
There you go, take us home.
Not much else to say.
Good luck, Blair. Good luck. Good luck.
I agree. The American dream is fundamentally at risk. We are at a critical point. I actually think we are living through one of the most critical periods in the history of the country right now, and I think there's many things we can do about it. My advice to the presidential candidate, more specifically, would be continue to revise the workforce development system in this country. It is in need of significant overhaul, even beyond WIOA. And the second thing would be create incentives for companies to innovate. In particular, thinking about ways to bring back the trillions of dollars that corporations have offshore, and how do we bring that back to invest in American workers, to invest in the future of this country, to create pathways of opportunity. Starbucks is doing our part as much as we can through our educational program that we've started with Arizona State University, where you can achieve a degree tuition-free, working 20 hours a week at Starbucks as a barista. You can actually go to ASU online, get a degree in any discipline, and once you complete that degree, you can leave Starbucks the next day. I think we need to incentivize corporations to innovate that way. That's just one example. I'm not saying it's the right one or the only one, but incentivize companies to innovate that way and invest in the human capital, which is the future of this country.
Great. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking everybody on this panel.